very, very similar to physical growth. Typically, we see these critical periods in prenatal, childhood, through adolescence, and then we have this kind of plateau through adulthood, and then we have a decline into older adulthood. So the skeletal system, usually bone growth has ceased and is just in a maintenance phase after you reach adolescence. We have kind of this transition to bone remodeling. So in young adulthood, typically we have these equal rates of bone remodeling and bone resorption. In older adulthood, bone remodeling starts to slow down and is actually more often than not kind of it's happening at a decreased rate or a slower rate compared to bone resorption. And bone resorption is kind of just taking in calcium from the bone and putting it into the blood. So I don't remember how many days bone remodels itself, or after how many days bone remodels itself. It's a very continuous process, so it's always happening. But I know during times of stress, so like we talked about, mechanotransduction and actually performing in physical activity is going to increase the rate of bone remodeling over the rate of bone resorption. When you have a fracture or a break in bone, that's going to increase bone remodeling over bone resorption. The different extrinsic factors can kind of play a role. Diet is also going to play a huge role. Now I'm kind of getting into like the last points at the bottom of the slide, but we know calcium has a huge role in just the contents of bone. It's mostly calcified material, right? So calcium, if we're low or deficient at certain time points in the lifespan, that can have an effect on how much bone remodeling is happening, because if we don't have enough calcium in our bloodstream to give to our bone, there is a homeostatic level of calcium, and eventually our body is actually going to say, well, we're deficient in calcium, and the best place we can get calcium if we're not getting it from our diet is our bones, and you actually increase the rate of bone resorption over the rate of bone remodeling if you're deficient in calcium. So diet and exercise, again, come into play. Hormone levels are also a huge thing to consider. Through adulthood, you have a decrease of about 1% of your bone mass per year starting as early as your mid-20s. So I think the average age is 25 to 30. That's where generally your bone mass or your bone density stops increasing at a faster rate than it's decreasing. So this is why we want to encourage kids as well as young adults to stay active up until that peak period, because after that it's just downhill. So the decreases again are due to dietary deficiencies, decreased exercise, but also for women especially, hormones play a big role in bone density, specifically when they get to about 55, 60 years old. And if we have this decrease in estrogen actually plays a role in inhibiting certain bone resorption cells, or cells that, are going to play a role in kind of breaking down bone. So that drop in estrogen means we have less inhibition of those bone absorptive cells. Words are hard, guys. But if we have less inhibition of those cells, that means we're going to just start breaking down bone a lot faster than we're remodeling. And if that rate is too high, some women often end up with osteoporosis, which is just low bone density. So I think this figure at the bottom of the page kind of accurately describes, we have this really, really huge peak, right? And this really strong increase in bone density up until like our 20s, and then for the rest of the lifespan we're just gradually kind of decreasing due to different factors. But the skeletal system, again, we can see diet and exercise as well as endocrine, right, are going to have huge roles. So once again, just kind of pointing to that interlinking of different body systems. But that can bring us to our muscular system. Body composition changes begin in young adulthood. And typically people lose about 10% of their lean mass between their mid-20s and their 50s. Now, this isn't a per year thing, it's just decrease in total between the 20s and the 50s. But this is also going to depend on extrinsic factors such as diet and exercise, right? Generally, lean body mass decreases while fat mass increases as we get older. Lean mass, again, is the result of more of the decrease in exercise component. So less physical activity means that we're not going to have that hypertrophic effect on our muscle mass or maintenance of an existing muscle mass, and we're going to end up with atrophy. So that's where the lean body mass decrease comes into play. Fat mass usually increases as a result of reduced physical activity as well as a result of poor diet. So this diet and exercise thing is ever pervasive in our life, guys. Also, typically as people get older, movement becomes more difficult or more painful, right? That decreased movement can kind of cause a chain reaction of events that self-perpetuate over time. So decreased movement could be related to degenerative disorders like arthritis. Maybe your life partner dies, which is really sad to think about. Your life partner could be a dog too, okay, or cat, I don't know. Dogs usually promote more physical activity though, so I was going to use a dog as my main example. But, like you have a death of a pet or a death of a family member, that can put you in a kind of a depressed mood state, which could lead, or maybe your family puts you in a retirement home or assisted living home, and you only have certain periods of the day where maybe you might want to go out, right? But any of these can lead to psychological changes, which lead to a lack of motivation, which might lead to a lack of physical activity. Decreased movement is going to lead to a decrease in muscle mass. Decreased muscle mass leads to decreased force production and strength, which we already talked about has a really big role on the maintenance of bone health. So if we're not engaging in activity and we're not placing a lot of stress on our bones, that means we're kind of decreasing the need for bone remodeling. Bone remodeling decrease is going to lead to decreases in bone density, which is going to lead for increased risk of fractures or breaks if somebody falls. And falls are going to occur because they don't have the appropriate muscle mass to control their center of gravity, right? Fractures are going to lead to a further decrease of movement, oftentimes bed rest for long periods of time. So you can see the self-perpetuated chain of events is just going to happen. Generally, as we get older, different factors of life kind of start to play a role in that. But also, with those, chain of events, just in the muscular and skeletal systems, we also see kind of this change in the adipose tissue as well. Both sexes generally tend to gain body fat with age, so our prime in terms of adipose tissue is usually in our adolescent periods if we generally stay pretty active and have good diet. The average adult weight gain in fat from early to middle adulthood for males is about 19 pounds, for females is about 22 pounds. Often, a lot of this comes on when you go to college and start independent living, right? I know for me, I think the freshman 15 was pretty consistent with my experience, and I was still pretty active because I was in the dance program for my school. But anyways, you kind of have this liberation of like, oh, my parents aren't controlling what I eat anymore. I can have pizza every single night if I want to. But also you can think in terms of weight gain. As you become an adult, you have a lot more responsibilities, right? So stress can play a huge role in gaining of weight. That's primarily due to our cortisol hormone, which is good in certain amounts, but can have very, very negative effects on our health in excessive amounts. So added stress can add to weight gain. Hormonal changes can add to weight gain. Inactivity can add to weight gain. Especially if you have financial responsibilities and you have to have a job. Maybe that job requires you to sit most of the hours of the day, therefore you cannot or distribute your time to physical activity as much as you once did. Or if you have kids, right, your priorities kind of shift towards your kids instead. So lots of extrinsic factors that could be playing a role in weight gain throughout this time. And then usually after the age of 50, overall weight gain or overall weight generally decreases. So we get a decrease of weight from the loss of muscle mass and bone density, kind of how we talked about in the previous slides. And usually there ends up being an increase in fat mass, particularly in abdominal areas, or increase in visceral fat, if you will. So again, adipose tissue is linked to a lack of movement and diet as well, right? All right, last thing we have to talk about is our endocrine system. So again, kind of two of our critical hormones that we were talking about was the thyroid hormones and gonadal hormones. The thyroid gland in its entirety is going to decline in function with age, which can lead to two different things. We can either have hypothyroidism, which would be low levels of thyroid hormones, which can lead to the acceleration of aging in body systems. Sometimes the function ends up kind of being hyperactive, which we call hyperthyroidism, where we have high levels of our thyroid hormones, and that can lead to congestive heart failure. At least it's been speculated it could lead to congestive heart failure, which is kind of contributing to our number one killer in America, which is kind of lands in the arena of cardiovascular disease. We also have our gonadal hormones decrease with age. So a lot of times people will use hormone replacement therapy, especially women will use estrogen supplementation if they're kind of in the onset stages of osteoporosis or have a more developed case of osteoporosis. That way they can maintain what bone density they've got left. For men, they usually have decreases in testosterone, so androgen supplementation can be provided to men to kind of prevent muscle wasting. But it has been found that some of these hormone replacement therapies can put some menopausal women at an increased risk of developing cancers. Not so much in men, because usually men don't have hormone replacement therapy as often as women do, but that could be potentially a negative side effect to that treatment. Insulin levels, and remember insulin is also a hormone that helps to regulate our thyroid hormone, or hormones rather, because there are quite a few. Insulin generally remains pretty comparable from young adulthood through older adulthood. The only thing that I can think of that will change this is type 2 diabetes, if that's developed over time, or if you have type 1 diabetes as a child. That is kind of just a maintenance level thing though, where you give yourself your injections because you don't have the appropriate number of cells to produce insulin. For type 2 diabetes, usually your body just it has a lower insulin sensitivity, so it's not triggered by higher blood glucose, which means that it's not going to produce as much insulin as it should. But other than diabetic conditions, insulin usually stays the same. For our nervous system, I lied, there was one more slide in terms of systems. The nervous system generally changes associated with age. So aging, we can see the brain on the right-hand side of the screen. The left side of the brain would be normal. The right side of the brain is an aged brain. So we can see that generally there's a loss of neurons, which is going to it's going to lead to the shrinking that we see. Loss of neurons means we don't have as many synapses, and we're also going to have a thinning of dendrite branches, so the receiving ends of the existing neurons, that remain aren't going to be as good at receiving information from other neurons. We also have changes and reductions in neurotransmitters. So decline of synapses is automatically going to tell us we're going to have a reduction in neurotransmitters, but we could also have reduction or changes in neurotransmitter activity. One specific example that I have on the top of my head is Parkinson's disease, which is reliant on the neurotransmitter dopamine, which plays a huge role in the deep basal ganglia structures of our brain, which is kind of in this area here. But those basal ganglia, normal functioning with that dopamine, is going to play a huge role in movement. How fast we move. So Parkinson's patients usually have rigid movement or akinesia or bradykinesia. Bradykinesia is just slowed movement. Akinesia is kind of the inability to produce voluntary movement. But having that change in neurotransmitter or not producing enough dopamine in the brain causes kind of this cascade effect into motor behaviors and how those deep brain structures communicate with our cortical structures up in these outer regions where we have I don't know what section of the brain this is specifically, but I know in the prefrontal cortex we've got our primary motor cortex, which is responsible for the generation of voluntary movements. So there is a connection or neural connection between the thalamus, which is one of the basal ganglia structures, and it connects up to that primary motor cortex. So we get movement changes, right? So we have kind of that down here, deteriorations in movement speed could be due to changes in neurotransmitters or reductions of neurotransmitters. We also could potentially have deterioration of myelin on our neurons. So remember, myelin is going to kind of help catalyze the activity within our nervous system. So if we don't have that catalyst, we're kind of removing our speed efficiency. So we can have reduction in movement speed, reduction in cognitive processing as a result of that deterioration in myelin, loss of neurons, which can lead to different things like short-term memory loss, dementia, or Alzheimer's disease. And then also we kind of start to lose stimulation to other body systems, which is why sometimes people have kind of like system failure as a whole. I know my great aunt, her digestive system started to go after she turned like 96. This woman lived till she was 104. She was quite amazing. But her cognitive abilities at 104 were still sharp. Like, she was a very witty woman. So that goes to show you neuronal loss can happen kind of anywhere, but the localization of where that loss happens directly affects kind of the outcomes that we can see in people. Whether that loss of neurons is in the basal ganglia leads to Parkinson's disease, could be loss of neurons is leading to like digestive tract, like my aunt, and you get system failure there, right? So could be a lot of different things, but deterioration is usually going to be based on where you have a loss of neurons primarily. So in summary, I know this was a long one, but systems do not develop and age independently of each other. I think that is probably the key thing to note, although each of them is fascinating in their own right. They all are tightly woven and their functions are integrated to promote function of each other, so they are not independent. Again, like we emphasized last week, there are periods in the lifespan that are more critical than others, or during which changes are more rapid than others, in which case that defines them as a critical period. Extrinsic factors can have an influence on development of these body systems at any point in the lifespan. I kept mentioning diet and exercise, right? Usually they're going to have greater effects later in life after the more critical periods of growth have passed, though, in terms of those being like the sole kind of factors playing a role in changes that we can see. Genetic factors can also influence predispositions to certain body system characteristics, but they have a greater effect during the prenatal development period, which is something that we emphasized last week as well.